A fake HOA compliance team tried to arrest a private tutor in front of a crying child, claiming he was violating neighborhood rules. Their ringleader, Carl Drummond, had built his power on fear and fake badges, terrorizing neighbors one petty rule at a time. But they had no idea Elijah Beck wasn't just any tutor. He was a Supreme Court clerk with powerful friends just one phone call away. And when the black SUVs rolled in, everything flipped. Just wait until you hear how justice finally hit back. It was supposed to be a normal Tuesday afternoon. Rachel Whitmore had just finished brewing a second pot of coffee when the doorbell rang. She assumed it was Elijah Beck, her daughter Lucy's new tutor. Elijah was always punctual, polite, and overdressed for a suburban kitchen table. Button-down shirt, leather briefcase, gentle voice, the kind of man you trusted instantly. But when Rachel opened the door, it wasn't just Elijah standing on her porch. Two stocky men in matching navy blue uniforms flanked him. Their shirts were stitched with HOA Enforcement Division in cheap block letters. One of them held out a cracked plastic badge that didn't quite catch the light the way a real one might. It looked like something you'd find in a toy aisle, and yet the man's voice was anything but playful. "We need to take him in," he said, jerking a thumb toward Elijah, operating an unauthorized business in an HOA-regulated zone. Rachel blinked. "What?" Elijah, visibly confused, calmly replied, "I'm tutoring a high school student in her own home." The second man, taller and more aggressive-looking, stepped forward. "Private instruction without HOA approval constitutes a violation. Section 14D. His tone was robotic, like he'd memorized it just to sound official. Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came out. The taller man reached for Elijah's arm, not roughly, but deliberately. Elijah didn't resist, but his eyebrows raised. Rachel could see he was trying to remain calm. Inside the house, Lucy peeked from the hallway, eyes wide with confusion. Then fear. "What's going on?" she asked, voice trembling. That snapped Rachel out of it. "Let go of him," she said, stepping between them. "This is my house. You have no right—" "We are the authority here," the first man interrupted, puffing up his chest. "The HOA has jurisdiction over all community activities, including yours." Lucy started crying. Elijah stood still, and Rachel, her voice shaking now, said the only thing that came to mind, "I'm calling the police." But the men only laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly, confidently. "Good," one of them said. "They'll back us up." That's when Rachel knew something was very, very wrong. Elijah didn't resist, but Rachel could see the disbelief in his eyes as the men led him down her front steps, like he'd done something wrong. They guided him, dragged him, toward a battered golf cart blocking Rachel's driveway. The thing had a makeshift light bar duct-taped to the roof and magnetic decals slapped onto the sides reading, "Neighborhood Enforcement Task Force." The cart wasn't just parked across her drive, it was parked like it belonged there, like it owned the street. Across the road, curtains twitched, first one, then another. Rachel saw Mrs. Tisdale peeking from her second-floor window, then the Connollys across the cul-de-sac, just silhouettes behind the blinds. They were watching, all of them, but nobody came outside, because they knew who these men were. Carl Drummond wasn't a stranger. Everyone in Evergreen Pines had heard the stories, how he'd handed out citations to parents whose strollers had unapproved wheel sizes, how he'd once called a tow truck on a volunteer firefighter's vehicle because it was parked at too much of an angle. No one took him seriously, not really, until now. Carl strutted beside Elijah like a man on patrol. His HOA polo shirt was tucked tightly into cargo pants, and he wore a utility belt that held nothing but a tape measure and a flashlight. Behind him, Greg lumbered along like backup, sunglasses on, jaw clenched, carrying a clipboard that gave him the illusion of purpose. Rachel caught up to them halfway down the driveway. "This is beyond insane," she snapped. "What exactly are you accusing him of?" Carl didn't even look at her. "Operating a for-profit service on residential grounds without prior written clearance from the HOA Compliance Board." Elijah, still calm, asked the question Rachel had expected from the start. Do you have any real authority? A badge? A warrant? Anything at all? Carl finally turned, his face twisted into a smirk. We don't need a warrant, he said. We're the governing body of this neighborhood. We set the standards and we enforce them. Rachel felt her stomach turn. His words weren't just empty. He believed them. Lucy had run outside by then, barefoot, still clutching her school folder. She pushed past Rachel, straight toward the golf cart. You can't take him. He's my tutor. He didn't do anything wrong. Carl didn't flinch. Greg looked at the girl for a second too long before muttering, Step back, miss. This is official business. Rachel reached for her daughter and pulled her close, her voice low but steady. This ends now, she said. You're out of control. But Carl just waved her off and climbed into the driver's seat of the cart. Greg shoved Elijah into the back as if this were all routine. As if they'd done this before. Maybe they had. Rachel's hands shook. She'd heard about Carl shutting down lemonade stands. She'd seen him bark at teenage boys riding scooters. She'd even watched him harass a mother walking her golden retriever too close to a flower bed. But this was different. This was a man laying hands on someone's guest, on a professional, on her daughter's tutor. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about control, ego, power that had never been given, only taken. And now the whole street was watching to see if Carl would get away with it. Again. Rachel had had enough. The moment Greg shoved Elijah into that ridiculous golf cart, something in her snapped, not from panic, but from clarity. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She pulled out her phone, stepped aside, and calmly dialed 911. There are 2 men detaining a guest on my property, she said. They're not police. They say they work for the HOA, but they're wearing fake uniforms and they're taking him against his will in a gekart. The dispatcher asked for her location and promised help was on the way. But Rachel wasn't finished. She turned back to Elijah, who still hadn't raised his voice. His tie was slightly crooked, but his posture remained calm, even as Carl barked orders and Greg fumbled with what looked like zip ties. Rachel crouched beside the golf cart and spoke quietly. Elijah, do you want me to call someone for you? He met her eyes with a slight nod. Yes, call this number. He handed her a slim business card. Ask for Assistant Director Morrison. Rachel didn't question it. She dialed the number on the card and barely got 2 rings in before a clipped professional voice answered. This is Morrison. Rachel quickly explained the situation, keeping her tone neutral but urgent. As soon as she finished, the line went dead. 3 minutes later, her phone rang again, this time from a blocked Washington, D.C. area code. The voice on the line didn't ask questions. You're at 512 Walnut Grove Lane? Do not interfere. Help is on the way. Rachel hung up and turned back to the street. She didn't have to wait long. Just under 5 minutes later, a black SUV turned the corner of the cul-de-sac. Not a police cruiser, not anything local. It was one of those matte black federal vehicles you only saw in the movies. It came to a stop without screeching or fanfare, silent like a shadow. 2 men stepped out, suits, earpieces. One held a leather wallet flipped open just long enough to flash a gold badge with an eagle seal. They walked straight toward Carl's golf cart with a focus that made even Greg freeze in place. Carl, however, squared his shoulders. This is a private community, he said, his voice full of self-importance. You can't just... The taller agent didn't slow his pace. Step away from the vehicle, sir. Carl narrowed his eyes. You have no jurisdiction here. We're enforcing our community standards under HOA code. You're impersonating law enforcement, the agent interrupted, voice flat as stone, and detaining a federal employee without cause. This man clerks for the United States Supreme Court. Silence. A thick, immediate silence fell over the entire cul-de-sac. Rachel saw Carl's mouth move, but no sound came out. His skin went pale. His arms, still crossed moments ago in defiance, slowly dropped to his sides. For the first time, Carl looked unsure of himself. Greg, on the other hand, panicked. He bolted, darted across Rachel's front yard like a linebacker sprinting for the sideline. But he didn't make it far. One of the agents signaled, and a second black SUV pulled around the corner, cutting off his escape. Within seconds, Greg was face down in the grass, hands behind his head, begging not to be charged. Rachel didn't move. She didn't have to. Lucy stood beside her, still holding her school folder against her chest. She looked up at Elijah, who adjusted his tie with a small smile, as if none of this surprised him. And maybe it didn't. It didn't take long for the real police to arrive. Within minutes of the federal agents making contact, 2 marked patrol cars rolled into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing. But this time it wasn't intimidation. It was confirmation. A formal handoff. Local officers took statements, verified the federal IDs, and placed Carl and Greg under arrest. Charges: impersonating law enforcement, unlawful detainment, trespassing, and possibly more, pending federal review. Carl tried to protest, muttering something about citizens' rights and community defense. But nobody was listening anymore, not even Greg, who sat silently in the back of a squad car, his clipboard forgotten in the driveway. Rachel stood by her mailbox, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The image spoke for itself, a woman who defended her home, her child, and her guest, against something that had been festering in her neighborhood for far too long. And the neighborhood? It didn't stay quiet. By evening, every door on the block had heard the story, some from eyewitnesses, others from smartphone footage that neighbors had finally been brave enough to share. Videos of Carl shouting about enforcement zones, of Greg reciting HOA codes like legal scripture, of Elijah, calm and professional, standing still while being wrongfully detained. The HOA board, long criticized for turning a blind eye to Carl's behavior, called an emergency meeting that same night. It wasn't even close. A unanimous vote removed Carl from all HOA duties. His self-appointed title, Chief Compliance Officer, was officially dissolved. A letter of apology was sent to Rachel. Another was drafted for Elijah, though he never asked for one. And as for Elijah? The next Tuesday, he returned to Rachel's house right on time, briefcase in hand. Lucy met him at the door, already flipping through her algebra notes. Rachel brewed a fresh pot of coffee. But this time, something was different. The neighbors, those same people who had once hidden behind curtains, were now outside. They waved, nodded. One even shouted, "Good to see you, Mr. Beck," as he walked up the steps. Elijah nodded back, a small smile on his face. For him, it had never been about titles or attention. He simply liked helping kids learn. He just happened to work for the highest court in the country. And as Carl was driven past Rachel's house, hands cuffed behind him, she stepped to the curb, met his eyes through the window, and spoke softly, just loud enough for him to hear, "You picked the wrong tutor." Carl looked away, and just like that, Evergreen Pines felt a little less controlled and a lot more free.